It's never a war crime the first time you do it. So I thought, oh, I'll come out, I'll raise the rear, and I'll stud convert the rear as well. But I forgot, I'm waiting on wheel bearings. Not sure how much you can see on camera, but these wheel bearings are shot, and the wheel bearings that I ordered are the bearing and the whole hub assembly, so I'm not going to put the studs in the hub that I'm going to throw in the scrap bin. I can at least test fit the 18s on it. I'm going to put it down before I touch anything with the coilovers just to see where it sits, and then I may or may not adjust it. The rear is actually not lowered very much to begin with, so I'm leaning towards not touching it. Not to mention the rear on the driver's side has a lug broken off in it, so this hub was going to be replaced anyway. I'm normally pretty good at getting broken lugs out of these things, but if I'm replacing the bearings, I'll just replace the whole hub. The whole assembly is like 45 bucks. It's not a big deal. It could definitely use some spacer behind it, but I'm pretty happy with the ride height, and I think I'm going to leave it as is for right now. It really doesn't look bad, but the wheel specs are fairly weak. How do I say this politely? This car wanted to die. This car was meant to die, and I spent a lot of my time and a considerable amount of money saving it from the scrapyard over the last 3 years, and pretty proud of it. Ugly as it may be, there's a lot of memories and sentimental attachment to this thing at this point, and really look forward to driving it. Wheel bearings have arrived, hub, bearing, giant snap ring, and axle nut. The axle nut is a 12-point nut. I needed a 30mm 12-point socket. To my knowledge, or at least from my quick research, they don't have 12-point impact sockets, so this is a war crime. Well, I guess it's not actually a war crime. It's never a war crime the first time you do it. So I'm gonna go ahead and bust the nut off of there, take the brakes off, and we're just gonna start working through this. That's all she wrote. I dropped the caliper off of here. Always hang those, or at least put them on a jack stand or something so there's not all that stress on the line. I have new lines for them, but we're gonna get into that probably after this season. If I pull the socket head cap screw out of the rotor, that'll pull that off, and then we can start going to town on the hub. So because this is getting a dual caliper with the hydro set up at some point, I deleted all this rusty stuff. This was what was left of my e-brake cable. This would be a more ideal situation if I was up at my shop where I have a large press, but I'm not. So in theory, I could have taken the whole knuckle out and pressed everything out with the press at the shop. But instead, I took two pry bars, this little guy, this larger but still little guy, and worked them in from either side behind the hub, between the hub and the knuckle, and just kind of shimmied it back and forth. I'd say that bearing was pretty well shot. I mean, I did beat on this pretty hard with a hammer for a while, but that bearing, I mean, there's still grease in there and it rolls nice, but the races were separating. So now I got to get this circlip out, and the next issue is going to be getting the rest of the bearing out. And I'm finding out now that my snap ring pliers are not large enough, so I'll be right back. I ran to the hardware store and AutoZone. The largest set that either had is the same size that I already have. So one of my homies at AutoZone said, well, why don't you just get a cheap set of needle nose? If you got to grind the tips, you can grind the tips. And I actually don't have to grind the tips. They fit right in here. See if I can do this one-handed. Might not be able to do it one-handed, but it does what I need it to. So I'm going to pull that out, and then we will try to get the bearing out. I pinched the crap out of my finger in the process, so that's going to be a blood blister, but we got it out. Time to work on the bearing. Having already been to AutoZone twice in the last hour, I'm actually going to pull the whole knuckle and take it to the shop and press the bearings out. One, because I'm too embarrassed to go back to AutoZone for a third time in an hour, and two, I don't like using rental tools. I prefer to buy things, and I really don't want to buy a bearing removal tool tonight. Just, I have a shop at my disposal. Use it.
Psych, I lied.
Small oversight. This is all one piece, not pulling all that out. So I'm gonna push the axle out. I went and got this bearing removal kit. It says front wheel drive, but bearing is bearing. So we're gonna make this happen. I mean, what else would you rather do on Mother's Day than rip the axles out of a 30-year-old German car? That gives me clearance to get the bearing puller in here, so that's next up. With the axle out of my way, I'm gonna take one of these cups, put it back here. You got to take the one that's the closest to your hole opening on the backside. You're good there. I'll hold this up to the backside, this on the front side, so it'll pull the bearing out through this. And then you put the cap on the front side and run this big bolt through all of it into that threaded coupler on the back side. As you tighten everything together, it will pull that bearing out of here. I don't have a 32mm wrench, so I just have an adjustable holding the nut on the back side. And probably should have put NICs on those threads, but we'll be good. We're just gonna gently run this on here and force this bearing out. Bearings out. Yeehaw, brother. And that's another one to the scrap bin. Buying the right tools makes everything so much easier. I cleaned this up with a wire brush. I just threw the bearings in the freezer so they shrink a little bit, and I'm gonna heat this with a torch when it's time to force them together. If I heat this, it'll expand. Freezing the bearing, it'll contract, so they should go in a little easier. I do a lot of that at work, so it is a proven theory. I know that it works. When I picked up the bearing press kit, I also got the proper size snap ring pliers so I can properly install those snap rings. For some reason, this is a full bottle of propane, but nothing wants to come out of this for me to ignite it. So I'm gonna take my chances with putting the bearing in. It's hard to film me assembling bearings, but they're in there. Put the axle back in, I put the new axle nut on. I need to peen the new nut so it doesn't come off of the axle. I torqued the bolts properly to the diff, so that's gonna be good to go. Stud convert this, call it a day.